1816, the year without a summer. 1800 and froze to death. The year 1816 stands out in history as a time when the world experienced an uncanny, disastrous shift in weather, plunging much of the globe into a frigid and dark season that seemed to defy all natural order. Known colloquially as 1800 and froze to death, 1816 was marked by an inexplicable cold that seized summer and turned it into a season of frost and famine. For those living through it, it felt as if the world had shifted on its axis. And for many, it was a time of fear, hunger, and profound uncertainty. This period was a direct result of one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded history, the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in April 1815. The eruption expelled an enormous amount of volcanic ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, which spread across the globe. The ash formed a veil that blocked sunlight, creating a dramatic cooling effect and causing the temperatures to plummet worldwide. The result was what we now call a volcanic winter, where typical weather patterns were altered so dramatically that the usual warmth of summer months never arrived. What follows is an in-depth look at this extraordinary year, reflecting on the personal stories, struggles, and anecdotes of those who lived through the summer that never came. Using diary entries, reminiscences, and first-hand accounts, we will journey through 1816 as experienced by the people who came to call it 1800 and froze to death. A world under a darkened sky. The effects of Mount Tambora's eruption were felt globally, but no place was immune to the strange and violent weather that followed. As the ash clouds circled the earth, it triggered atmospheric disturbances that led to what felt like a year-long winter in parts of Europe, North America, and Asia. For the people of that era, who had no understanding of volcanic activity's connection to climate change, the erratic weather seemed to defy explanation. In North America and Europe, crops failed across the board. Famine spread rapidly, and food shortages pushed societies to the brink. The harsh and bitter cold gave rise to folk tales, religious fervor, and desperate acts of survival. Europe's summer of starvation. In Europe, particularly in Britain, Ireland, France, and Germany, the weather turned treacherous in what should have been the heart of summer. Cold, wet conditions persisted, with frequent frosts, snowstorms in June, and torrential rains ruining crops. Many contemporary accounts give us insight into the year's grim impact. Anecdote 1. Mary Shelley's chilling inspiration. One of the most famous stories tied to 1816 comes from the literary world. The cold and bleak summer saw writers Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Mary Shelley vacationing together in Switzerland. The weather was so dreadful that they were confined indoors most of the time. It was in this gloomy, oppressive atmosphere that Mary Shelley penned her iconic novel Frankenstein. The novel's themes of life, death, and unnatural forces perhaps mirrored the chaotic weather outside. Byron himself wrote of the year's strangeness in his poem Darkness. I had a dream, which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space. Rayless and pathless, and the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. The gloomy atmosphere not only inspired the literary greats, but also reflected the eerie and uncertain conditions that pervaded that summer. As Percy Shelley would later recall, the rain continued with little intermission every day, and they would sit by candlelight, telling ghost stories to pass the time. Anecdote 2. German farmers' despair. In Germany, the cold and wet weather led to a complete collapse of harvests. Wheat, oats, and potatoes, staples of the rural diet, failed. Farmers were distraught, and food prices soared. A diary entry from a Bavarian farmer reveals the sense of desperation that gripped much of Europe. June 1816, we awoke to snow on the fields, and the morning frost killed what little had sprouted. We try to save what we can, but there is no hope. The potatoes are black in the ground, and the wheat stands stunted. The old ones say the end is near, but we can only pray for a return of the sun. In Switzerland, violent thunderstorms and snowstorms blanketed villages. That year, many believed it was divine retribution or a harbinger of the apocalypse. The experience in Europe, cold and fear across the continent. In Europe, where the Napoleonic Wars had only just ended, the population was already fragile. The erratic weather that hit in the spring of 1816 made things worse. Cold and frost continued well into the summer months. Rain was incessant, and the sun was rarely seen. Anecdote 3. The nightmares of Swiss farmers. In Switzerland, farmers endured the worst summer they could remember. One Swiss farmer from the canton of Fribourg wrote in his journal in June 1816, "The cows stand in their pens as if it were January. The ground is frozen solid. Every day brings rain, and the air smells damp with decay. We have already used the hay we should have saved for winter, and there is no grass left to cut. We pray for the warmth to return, but all we get is ice." The unrelenting cold and rain drowned crops, and livestock died from exposure. Farmers were forced to slaughter animals they could no longer feed, drying the meat as best they could. But even this was a temporary reprieve from the harsh conditions that stretched across the summer. Swiss lakes flooded, and villages that depended on alpine pastures were cut off from supplies. That summer, Switzerland looked more like the dead of winter than the height of the agricultural season. A pastor from Zurich wrote to a colleague in Bern in July, "We pray every Sunday in hopes that the Almighty will return the sun to us, but the skies remain dark and the air is chill. People come to church wrapped in coats and scarves. A woman told me this morning that her children are eating grass. How much longer can we last?" Many in Europe turned to religion, believing the strange weather was a punishment from God. Others saw the dire conditions as evidence of the apocalypse. Churches across the continent saw a surge in attendance, as fear of divine retribution grew with every passing cold day. Anecdote 4. Hunger and riots in France and Britain. France, too, felt the brunt of 1816's misery. After years of political upheaval and war, the French people had little left to give when crop failures began. Food prices skyrocketed, and hunger riots broke out in cities across the country. Bread was in short supply, and even the government's attempts to import grain were hindered by poor weather and failing harvests throughout Europe. In Britain, where industrialization had already begun to change the social landscape, hunger riots swept through cities like Manchester and Birmingham. One contemporary newspaper report from Manchester read, "Yesterday, a mob descended upon the miller's storehouse. With stones and clubs, they broke down the doors and took what little flour remained. The constables could do little to stop them. Women wept openly in the streets, for there is no bread to be had, and the price of meat is so high that only the wealthy can afford it. The merchants speak of disaster, and the sky is ever dark." The riots were not limited to cities. In the countryside, starving rural families began moving to towns, hoping to find food, but found little relief. Those who could not steal or barter were forced to beg or starve. North America, snow in June, frost in July. Across the Atlantic, the situation was just as dire. New England, already known for its cold winters, became the epicenter of strange weather in the United States. In May and June, reports of snowstorms became commonplace. Farmers who had planted their crops watched in horror as frost killed young plants before they had a chance to take root. Anecdote 5. The Farmer's Lament. In Vermont, one of the hardest-hit states, farmers and townspeople alike faced what seemed to be an eternal winter. A dairy farmer from Bennington, Vermont, wrote in his journal on June 7, 1816, "The snow lies heavy on the ground this morning. We've never seen such a sight in June. The children are in the barn, huddled around the stove, and the cows give no milk. We planted 2 weeks ago, but all is lost. The garden is dead, the field crops frozen. How are we to survive the year?" As frost continued into July, farmers across the region saw their corn and wheat crops fail. A letter from Massachusetts, dated July 9th, lamented, "Frost again last night. The corn is black in the fields. We hear the same from across the state and further afield. God help us, for we are ruined." Anecdote 6. Farmer's Journal from Vermont. A farmer in Vermont, one of the hardest-hit states, wrote in his journal on June 6, 1816, "Woke this morning to find the ground covered with snow. Never have I seen such weather in June. The apple blossoms are frozen on the trees. We hear of hunger already in the neighboring towns. The cattle low mournfully, no grass to feed them. By July, this same farmer noted, "We must eat the seed potatoes to survive." No word from Albany, but we hear of riots. Hunger rules. Reminiscence of New England. People remembered 1816 for generations. In New England, the year was burned into the collective memory, particularly in rural communities. Many moved westward, seeking more stable lands and climates. One elderly Vermonter, interviewed decades later in the 1850s, recalled, "That was the summer we all feared the end was near. The fields were barren, and there was nothing for us to gather come harvest. We sold what we could to make it through, but most went hungry. We spoke in whispers of witchcraft, and in the church, the preacher called it God's punishment. Migration and adaptation. America moves westward." The weather was so disastrous in New England that many families chose to leave the region altogether, heading westward into what is now the Midwest, seeking fertile land and the promise of stability. In this way, the year 1816 contributed significantly to westward expansion in the United States. Places like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois saw a surge in settlers seeking to escape the devastation of the eastern states. Anecdote 4. A family's westward journey. One such family, the Richards of Vermont, decided to leave their farm and head to Ohio after losing their crops. The father, James Richards, wrote in his family Bible on August 12, 1816, "Today we leave our home, which has given us nothing but sorrow these past months. The fields are barren, the trees are bare. It is time to start anew in a place where the ground may give us bread. I pray for my family's safety, for the journey will be long, but we cannot stay here and starve." The Richards were part of a broader migration wave, as thousands of families from New England and the Mid-Atlantic made their way west. This mass movement of people would lay the foundations for the growth of the American heartland in the years to come. Asia's monsoon failure and global consequences. While Europe and North America endured cold and famine, Asia was also reeling from the effects of the volcanic winter. In China, the monsoon season was drastically altered. Crops like rice, which were dependent on regular rainfall, withered under unusual drought conditions. In northern China, floods followed droughts, and the harvest failed. In India, monsoon rains arrived late and were erratic, leading to widespread crop failures and the onset of a cholera pandemic. The weakened population, suffering from hunger, became easy targets for disease. Thousands perished in the ensuing months. Reflections: a changed world. By the end of 1816, the world had been irrevocably changed. The volcanic winter not only caused mass starvation, migration, and economic upheaval, but it also left a deep psychological impact on the people who lived through it. The cold summer of 1816 became folklore, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale of nature's power and humanity's fragility. While the climate eventually returned to normal in the years that followed, the scars of 1816 were slow to heal. Economies, particularly in Europe, took years to recover, and the population shifts it prompted shaped the future of the United States. Global impact. The famine of 1816 was widespread. In China and India, monsoons were disrupted, leading to widespread crop failures. Famine and disease spread, particularly cholera, which was exacerbated by malnutrition and poverty. Food riots were common throughout Europe. In France, where bread prices soared, rioting mobs looted bakeries. The French government was forced to enact relief measures, though these came too late for many. In Ireland, which was still reeling from the effects of the Napoleonic Wars, the year without a summer was particularly harsh. Starving families took to the roads in search of food, and there were reports of entire communities being decimated by hunger. Long-term effects. The year without a summer had lasting consequences. In many parts of the world, the following years saw migration and economic hardship. Thousands of European families emigrated to North America, driven by both economic desperation and the memory of the summer of 1816. The United States saw a surge in westward expansion as people sought new, fertile lands. In New York and Pennsylvania, where cold and frost had killed crops, farmers packed up and moved to what would later become the Midwest, the new breadbasket of the nation. The volcanic dust that caused the cooling eventually settled, and by 1817, the climate returned to normal. But 1816 left a deep mark on history and became the stuff of legend. It became a cautionary tale of how fragile human civilization is in the face of nature's fury. Conclusion: the legacy of 1800 and froze to death. Looking back on 1816, it is clear that it was much more than just a freak weather event. It was a year that tested the resilience of humanity, forcing people to adapt, innovate, and survive in the face of insurmountable odds. It was a time when nature reminded the world of its unpredictable and sometimes devastating power. And yet, out of the hardship came strength, migration, and, ultimately, a renewed sense of community and perseverance. The story of 1800 and froze to death is one of human endurance, and it remains one of the most striking reminders of the fragile balance between humankind and the natural world.